Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators, in which Simon Borg will be looking at the essential underlying principles of planning professional development for teachers. My name is Shirin Soyoz, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining this live event. We have our monthly webinars for teacher educators every month, so you can register for our next sessions from our Teaching English website. As usual, before we start the session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. So while waiting, please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in service, type in-service in the Q&A. So this session is being recorded, and a recording will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days, and the link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive again in the next couple of days. And finally, you will have a chance to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenter your questions. So we'll be using the chat for announcements. You won't be able to write in the chat, but you can write in the Q&A. So if you have any questions during the session, please feel free to write in the Q&A. So let me introduce you to our guest today. First of all, yes, Simon Borg was our presenter again nearly this time last year again. He will be with us together in this session for teacher educators. And Simon Borg has been involved in English language teaching for almost 35 years, working in a range of contexts around the world. He's recognized internationally for his work on teacher cognition, professional developments, and teacher research. You can find out more about him at his website. And I'd like to invite Simon now to launch today's session.
Thank you very much, Shirin, for the introduction. I'll just get my slides up and we'll get cracking. Okay, so hopefully, Shirin, could you just confirm you can see and hear, please?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Excellent. So thank you, Shirin, again for the introduction. Thank you for the British Council for organizing this event and for asking me back. And thank you for all of you who've made some time in your schedules today to be with us. So we're going to look, as you can see from the opening slide, at some principles today for planning effective continuing professional development. I'll start by defining what we mean by CPD, the kinds of CPD we're focusing on today. Then we'll have a quick run through of 10 principles that are very important for us when we're planning and implementing CPD programs. At the midpoint, we'll stop to have a quick look at the results of the pre-webinar poll, and we could also take one or two very quick questions in the middle of the session, and then there'll be some time again at the end for a few more questions. Okay, let's start off by defining CPD, just to make sure we're all on the same page. You can see from this quotation here, the process by which alone and with others, and this is something we'll stress today, the with others dimension of CPD, teachers acquire and develop critically the knowledge and skills essential to good professional thinking, planning, and practice. So we are focusing on the ongoing development of qualified teachers, practicing teachers who are already in service. And when we think about CPD for these kinds of teachers, we can distinguish between CPD of the more independent kind. Teachers may find things to read books, articles, look for ideas online, have informal conversations with colleagues, just think alone about their work and reflect on it. These are all valuable activities which support teacher development. Today, we're more focused on the organized kinds of CPD. So these are opportunities for teacher development that are more formally provided by a ministry, sometimes an institution, an organization, or sometimes they're organized by a teacher or educator coordinator or facilitator at some kind, even at school level. And those are the kinds of programs we're focusing on today when there's some element of organization involved, when there's a program of some kind. 4 statements about the big picture first before we go into the 10 principles. These are important for us to establish, because everything else that we say today is based on these. First, that teacher quality matters. We don't need to spend long on that. It's a point that's been made repeatedly in the last 20 years. You can't have good quality education without good quality teachers. And the second assumption here is that CPD is necessary to sustain teacher quality. This is particularly true in contexts where pre-service teacher education is not very developed, and where graduates very often move into teaching without, a fully developed range of competences. In those contexts, CPD is even more vital, but generally we recognize CPD as a key ingredient in sustaining teacher quality. Thirdly, however, we also recognize that not all CPD is effective, as effective as it could be. And when we say it's not effective, we mean it doesn't lead to productive changes in the work of teachers and in the learning of students. And of course, if CPD was always optimally effective, we probably wouldn't need webinars such as these. And finally, global principles for good practice in CPD do exist. There are no templates or formulae that we can apply that are guaranteed to work everywhere. But if we look at international experience, if we look at international research and the literature, we are able to identify a number of global principles from across different subjects, which we can draw on in our field when we're planning and implementing CPD. And we'll be looking at those principles today. So these are four fundamental assumptions on which everything else we say today is based. Okay, let's move straight into our principles. I'll cover 5, as we said, then we'll have a short break to look at the poll, some questions, and we'll do the final 5. I'll move quite briskly because the goal is to provide you with an overview today. But don't forget, there'll be opportunities for follow-up in the weeks ahead through a write-up of the session and through other activities that the British Council will tell you about. So our first principle is to do with defining the objectives for CPD. It really is important when we start CPD, we start planning CPD, that we're clear about what it is we're trying to achieve. And questions like these are quite important. What student learning outcomes does the CPD aim to support? We mustn't forget that ultimately the goal of CPD is to improve student learning. And therefore, it's totally reasonable that at the start of the CPD process, we try to make connections between the developments in teachers we want to bring about, and of course, the developments in learning they will lead to. So can we make connections between student learning outcomes and CPD? Really important. A second question to ask when we're defining objectives is, as a result of the CPD, in what way will teachers' competences be enhanced? And I'll come back to that one in a second. And a third possible question, in addition to teachers, who else will benefit from the CPD? Teachers, of course, are always the primary beneficiaries of CPD, but others may also benefit. Colleagues within the school more generally. We've already mentioned students, of course. So let's come back to the second question there about teachers' competences. Teacher competence is a multi-dimensional idea. In other words, there are many elements to it, as you can see on the diagram there. And when we're planning CPD, it really is important for us to be clear about which of those we are targeting. We don't have to target all of them. It's probably unfeasible to try to target all of them, but it's important to be clear about which areas of teacher competence CPD seeks to develop. Is it their theoretical knowledge, their teaching skills, their language proficiency, etc.? And that's an important part in terms of defining objectives. So for each of the principles we'll talk about, there'll be some practical implications for us to think about as well. So in terms of objectives, we've got some implications there on the slide. We need to, when we're planning CPD, we need to ensure that objectives are driven by a concern for student learning. We need to ensure that the objectives are feasible, that they can be achieved in the time and given the resources available. It's always a good idea to share the objectives of CPD with key stakeholders, other teachers, school leaders, relevant people within the ministry, parents sometimes as well. And of course, another good reason for having clear objectives is that so that at the end of the CPD program or during the program, we're able to evaluate success against those objectives. So principle number 1 is to do with defining appropriate student learning-oriented objectives for CPD. Okay, principle number 2 is about understanding the context and the audience. It's very difficult to plan an effective CPD program without sufficient understanding of the audience, of the teachers we're trying to support, and of the broader context in which they work. So if we think about the teachers we work with, they have experience, knowledge, beliefs, motivations, they have needs and wants. They work in a particular school context. The more we know about these things, the better we're able to plan an effective CPD program for them. But of course, teachers and their schools are part of a broader educational system, which has policies, which has regulations, and the education system itself is part of a broader social cultural context, which also has an impact on teaching and learning. So the more we know about these issues at the start of a program, the better. So 2 implications here. We need to ensure that CPD is informed by and compatible with the context. And when we say compatible with, it doesn't mean we can't promote change. Of course, that's what we're trying to do through CPD, but we just need to make sure that the change is compatible, is feasible, is commensurate with the context. It's not too drastic or radical. A second implication there is that we need to learn as much as we can about the audience before CPD, or if that's not possible, during the CPD itself. I know that sometimes we don't actually know who is going to turn up for a CPD program until we start. And when that happens, we need to be learning more about the individuals as we work with them. All right, principle 3 is to do with building on teachers' existing practices and teachers' existing cognitions. And this is an aspect of what we call constructivist learning, this idea that that learning is more effective when we make connections between what people already know and do and what we'd like them to know and do. It's about making connections between the old and the new. So we can explain this idea using three graphics, 3 pictures. The first one is the iceberg. Many of you will be familiar with the metaphor as the iceberg as a metaphor for teaching. So we've got the part of the iceberg which is visible at the top. This reflects the observable dimension of teaching, what teachers do, what teachers say. But just like the iceberg in teaching, there's a lot going on beneath the surface that is not directly visible. Teachers have beliefs, knowledge, attitudes, thoughts, opinions. None of this can be directly seen, but of course, it does influence what teachers do. And when teachers come to CPD, they bring all of that unhidden, these unhidden dimensions of their work with them. The second metaphor is that of the lens. The way teachers experience new ideas, new information during CPD is filtered through the lens of what they already know and what they already believe. So if I'm working with a group of teachers, who have very strong opinions, for example, about grammar teaching, about the way grammar teaching should be taught, about the importance of grammar teaching. If I'm trying to convey new ideas about grammar, but I'm ignoring those existing ideas, I'm going to run into trouble, because teachers will just filter out the new ideas through the filter of their existing ideas. And this is important for us, because if we ignore what teachers bring with them, if we ignore the experience and the ideas and the beliefs that teachers bring with them to CPD, those existing ideas will act as a barrier, as a wall. So we're trying to convey new ideas. We're trying to get teachers to engage with new strategies, new thoughts, but because we haven't given them opportunities to explore their existing practices, their existing cognitions, those new ideas are not penetrating beneath the surface. It's like they're bouncing off a wall, and therefore the impact of our work is limited. We have a quote here which summarizes this point quite nicely, I think. It says, teacher development often has limited impact because it attempts to impose new ideas and practices on teachers without addressing the underlying filter of prior experience and knowledge, which can block learning. So I think it's an essential principle for all of us who try to support teachers and to bring about change in teaching. So there's just one key practical implication for us here as teacher educators or people involved in the design and delivery of CPD, is that it really is fundamental to create through CPD an awareness of current beliefs, current practices and beliefs before seeking to change them. We need to help teachers become aware of what they currently do and of what they currently think and believe before we can expect them to make changes in those aspects of their work. And this is because it's very difficult for teachers to change something they're not fully aware of. So this is a third and really important principle for us when we plan and implement CPD. Our fourth principle is about making CPD a situated process. This is a word we hear quite a lot in the literature these days. We want CPD to be situated. Let's explain what that means in practical terms. Here are four examples of how we can make CPD situated. The first one is by establishing localized connections to teaching and learning. So the content that is covered in CPD should make connections to teachers' local teaching and learning context. That's one way in which the connection between the CPD and what teachers do becomes stronger. And that's one way of making the CPD situated. Moving to the right, another way of situating CPD is making sure it's informed by local examples. When I'm evaluating CPD programs, teachers very often say to me, we enjoyed the program, we liked the ideas, but we didn't really get any examples from our own context. And I think it's really important for us when we're working with teachers to illustrate ideas with examples that come from context the teachers are familiar with. Again, it makes the connection between the CPD and teachers' working contexts stronger. It's also important to make connections between CPD and the curriculum teachers work with. In many parts of the world, teachers are required to follow a prescribed curriculum, which very often takes the form of a textbook. And teachers are more likely to engage with CPD and to transfer ideas to their classroom when they understand how those ideas are relevant to the curriculum. Again, teachers very often say to me when we're evaluating programs, yeah, we enjoyed the program, the ideas were interesting, but we just couldn't see how we can take those ideas and use them as part of our existing curriculum. So helping teachers make those connections is another way to make CPD situated. And finally, really important, this one is to create opportunities for teachers to experiment in the classroom. Teachers benefit from opportunities during CPD to go back to their classroom and to try out ideas, try out new strategies that they've been learning about in their classrooms with their learners, in the context of their curriculum. And again, that's another way for teachers to evaluate what they're learning and to find ways of adapting it and using it effectively with their students. So 4 ways here in which we can make CPD a situated process. And it's all about making strong connections between the content of CPD and the contexts teachers work in, their work in the classroom. So a couple of implications here. It really is important to establish these strong connections between CPD and what happens in teachers' classrooms. This adds to the relevance in teachers' eyes of the CPD. In contrast, when teachers don't feel there's much of a connection between CPD and what they're doing in the classroom, teachers see it as being less relevant and less interesting. The second implication there for CPD is that it's important to introduce concrete ideas. Teachers need to see concrete, practical ideas that gradually extend current practices and can be integrated into existing curricula. As we said earlier, gradual change is more likely to work than radical change, and gradual change that can be that can build on what teachers already do and that can be integrated into their existing curricula. So that's our 4th principle about making CPD a situated process. And the 5th one, just before we take a short break, is that it really is important as well when we're planning and implementing CPD to focus on both content and process. This is a really another very important principle. So both are important. We're not saying content is more important than process or vice versa. They both contribute importantly to CPD. Content is to do with what teachers are learning, and the process to do with how teacher learning takes place. And there very often is a tendency in the design of CPD for more importance or more weight to be allocated to the what, to the content, than to the process. And what we're saying through this principle, it's important to make sure that both are given their due importance. Now, when we think about the process of CPD, if we look at the literature, if we look at international good practice, there are a number. You can see quite a long list here of characteristics of CPD that are generally recognized as being beneficial for the process. So if you look on the left side here, where the arrow is moving upwards, we're trying to make CPD constructivist, as I said earlier, making connections between the old and the new, dialogic, so that it promotes interaction, situated, as I've just explained, collaborative, reflective, inquiry-based, and extended. These are all dimensions of the process of CPD that are generally recognized to be of value. We'll talk more about collaborative and extended CPD a bit later today. On the other hand, on the other side, you've got features of a CPD process that are more conventional. CPD that is transmissive, that focuses on communicating information, monologic, so very often lecture-based, generic, quite abstract rather than localized, individual, theory-driven, and short-term. We're not saying that theory has no role to play in CPD. It does have a role to play. We're not saying that there's no room for input or for mini lectures. They can all contribute in a positive way to CPD. But what we're saying overall is we want the emphasis to be on the kinds of processes listed on the other side of the box. And if we're going to focus on theory, we do so in a way that supports pedagogical understandings, for example, that encourages dialogue, that encourages collaboration rather than theory just for the sake of it. So a couple of implications here. Overall, we want CPD to be an active process. Active. All of these things we're talking about, making it dialogic, collaborative, reflective. These are all ways of making CPD an active, I guess, rather than a passive process. And it's also important to remember that in terms of processes, the process of teaching itself and the process of reflecting on teaching are two very core teacher learning processes. And that goes back to what I said earlier about giving teachers opportunities to go back to the classroom, to experiment with new ideas and to reflect on them. So really, really important when we're planning CPD, implementing CPD, that we pay sufficient attention, not just to content, to what we want the teachers to focus on, but also on the process, how teacher learning is going to occur. Okay, so let's take a short break from the principles. We've got 5 more to do and we'll come back to them quickly. We'll do a couple of things here. One is have a very quick look at the pre-webinar poll, and thank you for everyone who had a quick look at that. The poll asked you, I think there were 10 statements about CPD, and you were asked to choose 2 that you most agree with. And these are the 3 that were most frequently chosen in rank order. So number 1, that's the one that was most often selected, says teachers should be motivated to take part in CPD rather than being forced to. I'll comment on that briefly in a second. The second most common choice was that when teachers attend CPD, they are mainly interested in learning practical techniques and activities they can use in their classrooms. And that's perfectly understandable. There's no issue at all with that, because teaching is a practical activity. At the end of the day, it's about doing. And it's perfectly acceptable for teachers to be primarily interested in ideas they can use in the classroom. It doesn't mean, as we said earlier, there's no room for theory, or there shouldn't be critical reflection on ideas. But at the end of the day, teaching is about doing, not just about knowing. And the third most common statement that was chosen in the poll was the content of CPD programs should be connected to the curricula teachers work with. Great to see that one being chosen a lot, because it connects with a point we've already made today. So just very briefly on the first point, teachers should be motivated to take part in CPD rather than being forced to. Yeah, in principle, we can't really disagree with this. The reality, though, that in many educational systems around the world, CPD is very often a compulsory activity. There are reasons for that sometimes, because if you make CPD an optional activity, you may find yourself in a situation where most teachers are not willing to take part. So sometimes making it compulsory is something you have to do to guarantee participation, particularly if you're trying to promote systemic change on a large scale. However, it doesn't mean that, of course, motivation cannot be fostered even within CPD that is compulsory. So I think the question for us is, within compulsory CPD programs, what steps can we take to make the experience as motivating as possible for teachers? And applying the kinds of principles we're talking about today can go a long way in that respect. So if we're making CPD situated by making it relevant to teachers' classrooms, clearly that's going to make it more motivating for teachers. So I think applying these principles can be very beneficial in this respect. The other thing I want to do before we take a couple of very quick questions, in a previous webinar, there was a question that came up that was passed on to me, and it was, which is the single most influential factor that influences teaching learning? And that's quite a tricky question, isn't it? We're talking about 10 principles today, and they all contributed in their own way. But if I had to choose one of them, for me, it would be the principle that we're coming to shortly, to do with teacher support. Making sure that there's appropriate teacher support to enable teachers to learn and change is, for me, the most essential, I think, element in an effective CPD process. So I think we've got time for a couple of questions, maybe. Let me just hand back to the moderator, and she'll guide me on which questions are going to come my way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your input and insight. So we have already received some questions, and I'd like to start with the questions from Celestin. So it would be great if you could briefly summarize what is the difference between independent and organized CPD? Which one is the best?
They're different. Independent CPD is, for example, I am a teacher, and whenever I feel like it, just for my own development, I might find books to read, I might read articles, I might just reflect on my teaching independently. I might have informal conversations with my colleagues. I might decide to go to an event or attend a webinar. They are independent because I'm not doing those as part of an organized program. I've made that choice entirely myself, and I'm engaging activities which I choose and which I believe are beneficial for my development. And as I said at the beginning, such activities do make an important contribution to the development of teachers, But what we're talking about today is organized CPD, when there's some kind of, let's call it, program that's been set up and which teachers take part in. It may be a large program, can cover a whole country. It may be a program that operates at the level of the school. But it's organized because someone has developed it, someone is coordinating it, facilitating it, leading it. There is an official start and an end, perhaps, and there are objectives which have been set. So I don't think it's a question of which is better. I don't think we have any evidence to say one is better than the other. They both make a contribution to the development of teachers. But clearly, if you're trying to achieve consistent change at a systemic or a large scale level, and large scale could be at the level of a school, at the level of a district, at the level of a country, clearly you're going to need something that's organized. Independent won't work because every teacher will be doing their own thing. Next question, Siren, please.
That was a very clear answer. So our next question comes from Amir, and it's a key question that many of us encounter in our CPD planning. So Amir asks, how can we motivate disinterested teachers to care for their CPD when they perceive no need for that in their current context? You already mentioned the connections and CPD, making CPD situated. So can you please tell us once again, how can we motivate our teachers about CPD?
Yeah, it's an essential question, isn't it? We've all met teachers who don't seem particularly interested in their CPD. Now, does that mean they're not interested in becoming better? I find that hard to believe sometimes that any teacher would say, I'm not interested in becoming better. So I think what we need to do is try to understand what's behind that attitude. And there can be many explanations. One of them is previous bad experiences of CPD. If teachers have had bad experiences of CPD in the past, another opportunity comes around, they're likely to say, no, thank you, because my previous experiences haven't been beneficial. So that could be a reason. So then we need to try and demonstrate how the new opportunity is different in some ways. Teachers very often aren't keen to develop because they don't feel there's anything to improve in their teaching. And in these cases, it's lack of awareness. And this goes back to what I said earlier about creating awareness amongst teachers about what they do and about how effective what they do currently is. Creating that kind of awareness can change attitudes towards the need for CPD. So I think it is about trying to understand why teachers have negative attitudes to CPD. I've given two possible reasons, but there may be others, and then trying to address those as part of the process. Shall we move on?
Yes, let's move on to the next. Thank you so much, Simon.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. We'll come back to a few more at the end. Excellent. Okay, so we've got five more principles to cover. Number 6 for us is making teacher learning a social process. This is quite a straightforward one. A couple of quotations here to make this point. The first one says, teaching improves most in collegial settings. I've highlighted key elements there. Collegial settings where common goals are set and expertise is shared. So the emphasis there is on CPD, which values teachers working together, having a common purpose, and sharing expertise. The idea that teachers have expertise to share with one another, and that not expertise doesn't reside solely with the expert trainer or teacher educator. A second quote, which makes the same point in a different way, says it is improvement in social capital among existing teachers as professional communities that will lead the greatest and most immediate returns in terms of CPD. So improvement in social capital is improvement in relations between teachers or among teachers, improvement in teachers' abilities to collaborate, to work together, to share, to form professional communities. So both these quotes are making the same point. That anything we can do within CPD to give teachers opportunities to work together, learn together, is going to be beneficial, of course, as long as it's organized in a structured and effective way. There are many CPD strategies available to us that are collaborative in nature. We haven't got time to explain every one of those that you can see here, but if any of them are unfamiliar to you, there's a little bit of homework for you to do after the session. Go away, look them up and read a bit more about what they involve. But what they all involve is teachers working with others, either in pairs, as is often the case in peer observation, where teachers visit each other's classrooms, observe lessons and reflect on it together, or in larger groups. Professional learning communities can be large groups. Various types of online groups can be large. What they all have in common are that they require teachers to work together as part of their CPD. Another good thing about these strategies is that they can all be implemented at the level of the school. In other words, you can have groups of teachers within a school engaged in these kinds of activities. And there's a lot to say for the value of school-based professional development as opposed to professional development where teachers need to travel to other locations, for example. It does make the process logistically a lot easier. It is important to stress that if you're responsible for planning CPD and you're interested in implementing some of these strategies, that teachers will need ongoing support to benefit from them. In other words, if you're, say, a senior teacher in your school or a teacher educator in a school responsible for teachers, it's not enough to say to them, right, this term we're doing peer observation. I'll see you in a couple of months and you can tell me what you learned. That's not going to lead anywhere. For every one of these strategies, if we want teachers to benefit from them, they need to be supported. They need to understand what the strategy involves, what they're expected to do, how they're expected to do it, what the potential outcomes are. And it really is important because very often we see teachers being told to go away and do, I don't know, collaborative action research with maybe, one A4 sheet of instructions, but that's insufficient for them to benefit from the process. So what are some implications here of teacher learning as a social process, CPD as a social process? Well, we've got two. It really is important for those of us who plan and implement CPD to value teachers' expertise and use it as a resource for collaborative learning. It goes back to what we said earlier. Teachers bring resources with them. How can we use them as the basis of ongoing learning? And the second implication there is that social models of CPD can complement or provide effective alternatives to training courses and workshops. Training courses and workshops, of course, have an important role to play. They can make a positive contribution to CPD, but sometimes they can be combined with these school-based collaborative approaches, or indeed replaced by them entirely. Our seventh principle is one I mentioned earlier, is that it really is important to think of CPD not as a single event, but as an extended process. So we've got the extended process there. And a question that I often get asked is, well, how long is extended? You know, what counts as extended? And one way of answering this question is to think of CPD as a series of stages. Now, the number of stages will vary depending on the model of CPD we're adopting. The names of the stages will vary as well, but generally speaking, you know, CPD as a process will involve stages, and these stages will engage teachers in different processes. These kinds of processes are critical to teacher learning. You know, engaging with, receiving, and processing input. The processing is very important. Experimenting in the classroom, as I've already said, reflecting on experience, teacher's own experience, perhaps, and the experience of others. Receiving feedback can be a part of the process in certain models, sharing experience with others. So in a sense, an extended process is one that gives teachers repeated opportunities to engage in these kinds of learning processes. Okay, so it's not about whether it's a week or about a month. Clearly, a week is never going to be enough. I tend to think about a year, a school year, as being the ideal unit over which CPD can unfold. But of course, it can be a little bit shorter. I'm aware of programs which run for multiple years. But clearly, it's not possible to provide teachers with repeated opportunities for these kinds of processes in a few weeks or in a month. Similarly, CPD, which packs 50 hours of learning into a week, is not going to be able to provide this kind of extended opportunity for learning that teachers need. So the implication here is a very clear one when it comes to the design of CPD, that teachers need opportunities to engage repeatedly and over time in key processes that support their development. We can have intensive workshops, we can have intensive courses, but ideally these are distributed over time so that in between teachers have opportunities to engage in these kinds of processes, particularly going back to their classrooms, experimenting and reflecting there. Our eighth principle is to do with the importance of providing ongoing teacher support. And I referred to this earlier, didn't I, when I was trying to answer the question of the single most influential factor. As I said, I don't think it's a question we can really answer, but if I had to, I would probably choose this principle. Now, teachers need support at least two stages in CPD. One is support to actually engage in CPD. As I said earlier, if we want teachers to do peer observation or to do lesson study or to take part in reading groups, they need support to understand how to do that and how to do that effectively. So that's one kind of support at the start of the process. Similarly, if teachers are doing an online course, and as part of that online course, they're expected to, I don't know, contribute to online forums or to submit, I don't know, reflective commentaries. They need support to understand how to do that. But another kind of support, which is perhaps even more important, is this support to innovate. And I've highlighted this as a critical moment in the CPD process, the moment at which teachers are ready to start making changes in their lessons and to experiment with new ideas. This is quite a challenging moment for teachers because it involves an element of risk. Teachers are going to do something different. The learners are going to notice something different is happening. Colleagues may notice. Parents very often are very quick to comment when they realize teachers are doing things differently. School leaders may also have an opinion. So the moment in the CPD process where teachers are required to change what they do in the classroom is a critical one. Yet, ironically, it very often is the moment where teachers have least support. And if teachers are not going to be supported when it comes to making changes in the classroom, they very often won't make these changes. And then the whole purpose of CPD is being defeated. If CPD results in no change in teaching and learning, it's not fulfilling its ultimate process. So it really is vital within any CPD program to ensure that at the critical point at which teachers are required to innovate, that there is support for the process. And where is that support going to come from? There are several sources. Ministries in the form of inspectors and supervisors are well placed to support teachers. Unfortunately, we've all heard of stories where teachers are trying to innovate, but the inspector or supervisor visits them and is not supportive of what they're trying to do. School leaders, teacher educators, especially those who are based in schools, colleagues, and as I said, parents. They can all provide support for teachers who are trying to make positive, productive changes to teaching and learning in classrooms. But of course, for this to happen, and here are our implications for this principle, the CPD planning needs to include working towards buy-in for change from key stakeholders. We need to identify these key stakeholders, the ministry people, the schools, colleagues, parents, school leaders, and make sure they're aware of the CPD program, what it's trying to achieve, and what teachers, what kinds of changes teachers are likely to be making. We need to create structures within schools that support teachers as they try to make changes to their work. One simple structure is getting teachers to work together so that they're making changes as part of a group rather than working individually and carrying that burden and that risk in isolation. But if you've got 2 or 3 teachers on a program who are changing together, that makes it a lot more feasible. And finally, as part of CPD, it really is valuable to keep in touch with teachers when they go back to schools and to get feedback from them about how easy or difficult it has been to implement change and what the obstacles have been. And you can use that insight to continue developing your CPD program. So this is absolutely essential. If teachers do not reach the point where they're willing to adapt their teaching, to experiment with new ideas, CPD is not going to achieve its ultimate goal. Okay, last 2. This one is about the importance of teacher-educator competence within a CPD program. It's a simple point, really. The quality of CPD that teachers receive is significantly affected by the quality of the teacher educator or the facilitator or the coordinator who is supporting them. It's very important but straightforward point. Now, there are various frameworks out there. One I can highlight very quickly is the British Council's CPD framework for teacher educators. And this identifies the different kinds of competences that teacher educators need in order to support teachers effectively. There are 12 elements that are called professional practices within this framework. You can see the link there where it's explained in detail, but these are grouped into teacher educator skills, teacher educator knowledge, and teacher educator involvement in their own development, attitudes towards their own development. And what we're saying is for a CPD program to be optimally effective, we need to make sure that teacher educators are equipped to support teachers in the ways that are required. The specific competencies that teacher educators need most will vary depending on the kind of program and the goals of the program. But overall, the argument is that all of the elements in the British Council's framework and other similar frameworks are important. So implications if we're planning CPD, we need to recognize the specific competences that teacher educators need. It's not just about making sure they have teaching experience. That is, of course, important, but there's a lot more than experience as teachers that teacher educators need. We need to support the development of these key competences as required. Teacher educators may need support, training, guidance at the beginning of a program. They may need ongoing support during a program to ensure that they've got appropriate competences to support teachers. And of course, thirdly, it's important to monitor teacher education performance during a program in order to identify, again, where continuing support is needed. So we mustn't forget then the critical role that competent teacher educators play in determining the success of CPD programs. And finally, we made it to number 10. This is a very sort of concrete and practical one, as the principle states. It's about optimizing practical arrangements when it comes to CPD. Yes, we need to think carefully about content, processes, and to conceptualize what we're doing and to theorize what we're doing. But it is important not to ignore the impact of the practical arrangements on how effective teacher CPD is. So, there are a number of practical factors that are influential, such as when the CPD takes place. When I evaluate programs, one thing that teachers very often mention to me, they say, the content of the program was interesting, the teacher educators were great, but we were very unhappy with the scheduling. And, teachers can be demotivated by that. It can affect their engagement. Another factor is how much time it requires of teachers. We need to be realistic about the demands we make on their time, particularly, if CPD is taking place during their own personal time. Another practical decision is where the CPD takes place. Again, are we asking teachers to travel long distances, very often at their own cost, for example? Not ideal. The mode of delivery, face-to-face, online. How can we best combine these, or how can we best choose one or the other? And the resources that teachers need. What kinds of resources are teachers expected to have to take part effectively in the CPD? Do they actually have those resources? Are we able to support them in that? So this is very, very concrete stuff, but undoubtedly, from my experience, it makes a big difference to teachers. So the implication here is that CPD planning should consider the impact that organizational decisions may have on teachers' motivation and their ability to participate in CPD in a sustained way. These things do matter. So those are our 10 principles. I'm sure we could add a couple of more, but I think 10 is a nice number to get through in the time we've had today. That's just a summary. As the visual suggests, they are interconnected. That's why the question about which one is most important is tricky really to answer. They are interconnected. And what we're saying is, when you're planning CPD, when you're implementing CPD, the more of these principles that you can address, the more likely it is that your program is going to have productive, beneficial impacts on teachers, and subsequently, of course, on teaching in the classroom, and ultimately on learning as well. So I will stop there, and I'll hand back to Sirin, who will manage the final question and answer process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. So we've received really insightful questions from our audience today. So honestly, it's a challenge to choose, but we have selected some. So we have 3 questions closely related concerning changing mindsets and its challenges. So I will try to combine them. How can we encourage teachers to embrace and practice new teaching ideas aligned with the curriculum, especially when many are rooted in traditional methods? So Sachin, Pony, and Parimela asked similar questions. So they say we teach them, but they are not ready. How to prevent traditional conditioning of teachers' minds?
Yeah, it's an important but complex question in a sense that would justify a longer answer than I can provide. But I think key elements to keep in mind. One is that it's a process. So we need, as we said, we need time to work with teachers in order to bring about change. Change isn't going to happen because we tell them to change. We all know that. So if we don't have time to work with these teachers, straight away, we're in a very difficult situation. Secondly, what we do with that time matters a lot. So as I've tried to emphasize, creating awareness is an important part of the process. Teachers are not very often aware of what they do. They're not aware of the impact it has on learners. So how do we create an awareness of these issues? A third thing teachers are not aware of very often are alternatives. So again, expecting them to change without presenting them with feasible alternatives, it's not going to work. So how do we create awareness of what they do? How do we create awareness that what they do isn't maybe as effective as it could be or needs to be? How do we create awareness of alternatives? Then how do we create the conditions in which teachers are willing to engage with those alternatives, which goes back to what we said about supportive conditions for change. Teachers are very often scared of changing because they're going to get into trouble. They're going to get reprimanded by a supervisor, a head teacher. Their colleagues are going to, look at them dubiously and saying, what are you doing? So we need to think at the level of systems here in order to create these kinds of conditions. So that's a very brief answer to a complex question, but it is all about, the process and what we do as part of that process.
Thank you, Simon. It was, yes, a very difficult question. But yes, your answers are like a capsule that summarizes the main points. Kamal has a very brief but very powerful question. How often should we go for CPD as a teacher or as a teacher educator? So how often should we go for CPD?
Yeah, how often, if we're thinking about it as an ongoing process, of course, it doesn't mean you're doing CPD all the time. I mean, it is hopefully a mindset that you're engaged in all the time, the mindset of growth and developing. But it depends on what you mean by doing CPD. If CPD for you is, reflecting on your teaching, talking to your colleagues about teaching, exchanging ideas, there's no reason that is something that can't be happening or every day. If you're talking about attending a course, a formal course, going to a conference, doing a more formal piece of research, well, clearly that's not something you can do all the time. Maybe that's something you're going to do once a year. The great thing about CP, there are so many different ways of doing it, independent and organized, but there are so many opportunities for teachers when it comes to CPD that it is possible to be almost constantly engaged in the process without it becoming too much of a burden, which is of course very often a challenge for teachers. So it's about choosing CPD appropriately, making sure it's doable given all the other demands on your time and the situation in which you work. And then I think having an effective blend of the less formal kinds of CPD that you can be doing, and then less often, of course, the more formal kind of organized programs that you engage in.
And for those contexts in which a CPD program is implemented, Teodros has a question. How do we know a CPD is effective or not effective?
Yeah. Evaluation isn't a principle I talked about today, but it is one that we could add. But I did mention when we talked about objectives in the first principle, I said that one very good reason for having clear objectives is so that we can then evaluate the success of a program. So how do we know whether a program is achieving its goals? Well, we need to think about an evaluation strategy, which should always be part of a program. And as part of that strategy, what we do is we collect evidence which allows us to assess how far and how effectively our objectives have been met. So it's about having an evaluation strategy built into the program, which could be, principle number 11 if we wanted to.
Thank you. Yeah, Maria has also asked similar questions, so we hope this answered. I mean, looking at the objectives, that will be hopefully have an impact on the final outcome. So up to Dalem, sorry, apologies for mispronouncing. Up the Daim has a question. We are preparing a CPD seminar next month. What main points do you think we should focus on? So as the final question, Simon.
If we apply some of the principles I've been talking about to the planning of your CPD seminar, think about who your target audience are. Think about what they need. Think about what you can achieve realistically, given the time and resources available. Think about what's going to be relevant to them and to their work. And then you start making decisions about content and process. But it's not a question I can answer with absolutely no information at all about the audience and the context. So I'm being consistent with my principles here by giving you that kind of advice. But I hope the seminar goes well.
We hope so. So it's like the idea is that we need to value our colleagues and understand their needs and prior experience, and work together with them as collaborators. So instead of top-down approach. So this is what I understand from your session. So
yeah, I do want to emphasize, we're not saying that there's no role for input of an external kind, but it's important that teachers experience that input in a way that's meaningful, that allows them to build on what they already do and what they already know, that allows them to make connections with teaching and learning in this context. So theory does have a role to play. The difficulty sometimes is the way in which teachers experience it.
Mm-hmm. That's right about this awareness. So we have unfortunately we don't have much time for this session, but Simon, first of all, a heartfelt thank you for such an enriching session. So we learned a lot in such a limited time, and we hope that our participants also found the session useful and picked up useful ideas to reflect on when supporting teachers. So I would like to share some reminders. So first of all, the recording of the webinar and the link to the certificate will be provided in the next couple of days. So you will find the recording on Teaching English, and you will also receive an email, a thank you email, which will also include the feedback form in the next couple of days. And I'd like to also bring your attention to an important follow-up session with Simon Borg, scheduled on the 3rd of October, but this will be an exclusive session with Simon. And if you would like to attend, please indicate your interest in the feedback form that you'll receive in the next couple of days. And from those expressing interest, 3-4 teacher educators will be randomly selected based on our spaces for this session. So please make sure that you fill out the form if you want to be considered for this exclusive follow-up session with Simon, in which you will be able to ask your questions directly by unmuting your microphone. And don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter. So every month we have a webinar for teacher educators. You will find out more about our future webinars on the Teaching English website, and we very much hope to see you all again in the future sessions, and hope to see you soon, Simon, on 3rd of October in the next follow-up session.
Thank you very much, Shirin, and thank you to everyone again for joining us today.
Bye, everyone.